Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mike Taylor from Hopkins Architects, a principal at Hopkins Architects, who is going to talk about designing for embodied carbon. Many of you will know that Hopkins is an international architectural practice with studios in London and Dubai. The practice has designed and delivered a vast array of really prestigious projects. Just to look at the website is hours of interest and fun. And this particular talk will be delivered by Mike, a principal since 1992, has worked since 1992, perhaps not a principal since then, but certainly has a long career in the practice, and who is going to be presenting the flagship scheme at 100 Liverpool Street, which was shortlisted for the 2022 RIBA Stirling Prize. Mike has been creative lead on several very high-profile projects, including the 2012 Olympic Velodrome, the Living Planet Centre for the World Wildlife Foundation, which is described as an ultra-green building. That's a very particular shade of green, which I think we're going to hear some more about. The School for Environmental Science at Yale. And I clearly, as a training in architecture, studied at Bristol and the Mac. I'm going to hand over to Mike now, really without further ado, to present his talk. Mike will talk for about 40 minutes. Maybe a little less, maybe a tiny bit more, we'll see, but around then, so that we've got time for questions and comments afterwards. We will make a firm end at 2:00 so that everybody can finish their lunch on time. This is absolutely designed to accompany lunchtime, but please get your questions ready, put them in the chat. I will try and field as many of those as I can towards the end. I just want to say thank you so much, Mike, for joining us. I have very, very distant memories. They are very present, but from a very long time ago. One of my first favourite visits were to two buildings by Hopkins, the Schlumberger Research Centre and the David Mellor Factory, which just embody extraordinary a hybridity of high-tech, low-tech, material context, truth to all of those things, but in an extraordinary contemporary fashion. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about 100 Liverpool Street. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. And good afternoon, everybody. And bon appetit, because you're probably all having your sandwiches. Well, if we start sharing the screen, I hope you can all see that. Yeah, good. Okay, so as you can see from that image, we're talking about a big building today. Not a typical student building at all, even for master's or diploma, but it's quite an interesting one. It's a very challenging project, and it kind of also shows that at the start of a project, you're not entirely sure what it's going to come out like at the end. Certainly lots of challenges on this one. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey through this project. And you're probably too young to remember what Broadgate was like before. This was Stuart Lipton and Peter Fogo's kind of vision for a somewhat American version of city life. So they invested an enormous amount of money putting this project in, because they put all the vehicles and deliveries beneath the ground. So that space you see there with those sort of quartet of buildings or trilogy of buildings is all supported by deep planned basements with lorry access. So, quite unusual, really, and against the grain in the city to have this sort of pedestrianised central space where there was the circle, which you see there in the middle. That's been sort of renovated by Arup. But the buildings by Peter Fogo were quite quirky. They had lots of split levels. They contravened all sorts of DDA requirements. And spatially, they were odd. They had atria on the outside and were really challenging to let as floor plates. So it had been associated with the sort of Big Bang, and it was Fortress Broadgate, where the financial sector, set up their offices. But in the sort of move of London towards the east and the popularity of Shoreditch and roundabout, British Land, who own this whole piece of land, were keen to promote sort of 24/7 Broadgate and change the nature of how that space in the city was used. And the project came with some pretty extraordinary challenges, 10 of which are just outlined here. We had to build right next to Liverpool Street station and keep everything running. We had to retain 50% of the existing structure by some deed in their contract with their funders, but that proved to be a positive thing in terms of the carbon story, as you'll hear. We had 2 underground tunnels underneath the site. We had a bus station underneath the site. Network Rail owned the shops beneath the site, and they needed to keep trading. The basement I talked about on the left there, the gyratory, had to connect into this project. We had Richard Serra's amazing sculpture, the Fulcrum, which obviously needs to be retained. We had view corridors to St. Paul's Heights. All the public circulation had to keep going, and they were building a Crossrail station immediately outside and building Crossrail at the same time. So if you say that was difficult, we also had Brexit and a pandemic during the construction. So it was truly quite difficult. So one of the most salient things about this project in terms of the carbon story is that it was built in the mid-80s. And as I mentioned, it had a sort of slight American feel to it. And one of those aspects was that it was a fast-track construction process, because around that time, inflation was quite high. And the American model would be to start the project before you got everything fully designed, and using either construction management or management contracting, you would let the early packages and then build the building on a kind of series of specialized packages as you went up. So you could, in other words, start the foundations before you'd worked out what the cladding were. Now, the good thing retrospectively was that meant everything structurally in the ground and the frame was somewhat over-designed. It's also true they kept incredibly meticulous records of all the concrete tests and all the materials. So we were able, with AKT2, to access all of that and work out the sort of latent capacity of this structure, which by now had sort of bedded down and consolidated in the ground as well. Peter Fogo had designed it with this pink granite facade, which is also incredibly heavy. So we knew we had some spare capacity in the frame and the foundations to take additional load. With that, we might be able to sort of increase the amount of square meters we could build on. And I think it is a really interesting idea for London and renovational projects that all the foundations have a sort of latent capacity, and it might not be fully realized. And if you can come along and get more area on those foundations, it's a very good story for the city in terms of the need to densify, particularly around train stations and all the usual mayoral discussions about that, but also just in terms of the carbon story. So what we were able to do here was take the existing structure. The red is what we tampered with or demolished. And so we retained about 50% there. 100% of the foundations were retained. We couldn't redo foundations because it would have meant going through all the ground floor retail, etc., and the basement, which we couldn't touch. But on top of that, we could build up. And AKT did an enormous amount of work analysing all the beams and the columns and everything else. So we were able to add some columns in, and we were able to modify beams and structure. And what that allowed us to do effectively was build the purple on top of the brown. So we could get 3 extra floors on top of this building just by fully using the foundations as described. So that was a significant increase in area. And the building was built for trading floors, level 2 to 3, which had big, computer floors with old-fashioned PCs that got very hot. So they were big, tall floors. The other floors were smaller. And then when we put new floors in on the top, 7 to 10, we're able to get more floor-to-ceiling height with the same floor-to-floor height by just integrating the services in the structure in a better way than being done before on levels 4 to 6. So there's elements of compromise in buildings like this, but we managed to make these not problematic. So the other thing we did is we took that diagram on the left, which, as I said, had atria on the outside, which is a bit nonsensical, and it had cores that didn't allow the floor plates to be divided up. And we put a core in the middle and put an atrium in the middle and moved the cores around. Now, the start of the project, British Land were very, very keen to maximise area, and we were sort of granted license to have a small square atrium like that. As the project moved on and we realised we could gain more area, they cut us a bit of slack on that, and you'll see we came up with a much more interesting spatial arrangement in the middle of the building. So this was the plan from before, and it had on quite the sort of small column grid with bigger spans, and the bigger spans are over the mall, which connects to the Liverpool Street station, which you'll see, and that's where the 2 atria were as well. So the green columns were ones that we were going to kind of move and juxtapose, and the red ones were ones that we were going to retain. And what we did was we sort of used that capacity of that frame and the lighter facade to build out and give ourselves that extra perimeter around the building in the green there. Interestingly, that allowed us also to take the aesthetic of the building, which had been these sort of grouped together more extruded elements, and think of something much more curvilinear and flowing. And that seemed to be appropriate given the enormous number of people that move around this site and the sort of attritional pebble in the stream nature of how the building could sit there seemed attractive to us, that we could work that and shape it around people flows. So what that meant was that we were getting overall, with the extra 3 floors of building out and sort of searching for area everywhere, we could get a 45% extra net internal area, which is what your commercial clients are interested in. That's the bit they let out. So that was a significant increase. And that building at that size is not far off the size of many of the towers in the City of London, the smaller ones. And yet it's only 10 floors high, really connects to the ground, connects to itself, views back to itself. And so there's quite a few differences between a building like this, which is enormous, but a ground scraper and a tower. So in terms of that cladding and the replacement, we did some work on, how's that going to be efficient? You've got a really deep plan building. So inherently, you'd want as much glass in the facade as possible to get light deep into the building. But you've also got to, stop it doesn't get too hot with heat gains and stop it doesn't get too cold in the winter. And there was a sort of notional 60% sweet spot in terms of targeting where we should aim for with our glazing. And we had different M&E systems. So we worked out with Chapman BDSP that would go with those. So we were aiming for about 60%. And what we did was we took that kind of really quite complicated geometry that we'd developed and started to break it down into a series of very rational segments. The building's curved, but the glazing isn't. The glazing is faceted. And what we'd learned in the velodrome was that there's only 2 things on the velodrome that are curved. One is the ring beam around the top, which is an old gas pipe from the American gas and oil industry that somehow they managed to get. And the other thing that's curved is the track. Everything else is faceted. And on the outside, the timber cladding is faceted. And we put little stainless steel verticals between those segments. So using that same trick, we put these mullions on the outside of the building, and they would allow faceted glass to come together without you really realizing it was faceted and give you that sense of curvature. They also had 2 other important functions. They were wind stiffeners for the facade, so we could have minimal framing on the facade, and these helped stiffen it. And they also provided really important shading. They're about 300 millimeters deep, and that was a real key part of the project. So even though the building faces in all directions, each one of these will be doing shading at different times of the day. So not conventional southerly shading, but nonetheless shading on the facade. So those of you that have worked in officers working on office buildings in your years out, you'll know the importance of the BCO guide and how agents like to let buildings on a sort of standard 1.5 grid. So we made our facade elements, certainly on the rectilinear bits, 1.5, and the whole building was set out on a 1.5 grid, which it hadn't really been before. And what we did was we put a channel in at the floor level, and then we needed some opaque glass, and we needed these fins to achieve the shading. So when we had the opaque areas, rather than use metal, we wanted to use glass, but we wanted to give that some interest. So what we did here was we took solid glazing with insulation behind, and we fritted the glass on the outer and inner layer so that the cavity gave us some nice shadow effects. So that had some life to it visually. And here you see how we managed to take that around the curve. You'll see that's all actually faceted, and then the steelwork or aluminium is faceted as well. And you can see how those fin elements sort of help you wrap around that shape. Interesting, you'll notice that the very top curve of that element is curved, not faceted. Just so as you look at the sky, the very top profile of that last steel is actually curved. And then from other directions, that looks incredibly solid. And that has an interesting visual aspect because it starts to pick up reflections and shadows of the neighboring panes and fins as well. So even though it's a glass building and it has all this sort of metalwork on the outside, it has a visual richness and an honesty and integrity to it as well. So that's the sort of pattern I mean, where you start to pick up shadows and reflections and refractions on those elements. And so certainly when the sun's out, it becomes quite a dynamic sculpture, if you like, and changes throughout the course of the day. And you'll see there that how we've used those opaque panels at top and bottom just to get down to the 60% visual area. So overall, the building performed well. We went for a number of kind of targets, as you do on these sorts of things. But the most significant one is that we're at 389 kilograms per square meter of carbon equivalent. So that's pretty good. I mean, the RIBA targets were about 500. I think they put them up to 600 and odd because it was very hard to achieve that. And it's partly possible because the building is so big, and it's certainly possible because we managed to retain the structure and keep 50% of that existing structure. So, and now to sort of pan out and talk a bit about how the building was organised and how it's more than just an office building and how it connects to the city. So this is a drawing that AHMM had done for the subsequent building, which is 1 to 2 Broadgate, which is in the foreground. So our building is sitting here. This is the Broadgate Circle. This is number 5 Broadgate by Make, and 1 to 2 will come here. So this is a nice drawing of the kind of ground plane, showing the retail and social aspects of the buildings as they hit the ground. So here is the way through from Liverpool Street Station, which you're probably all familiar with. There's the sculpture, and this is the way through to the rest of the Broadgate estate. So the number 5 by Make is for USB, which is a Swiss bank, and they did not allow any retail at ground floor. So the building is incredibly dense and doesn't offer much back at street level at all. It's all about an internalized banking activity. So we felt this building should compensate for that. And we, by now, British Land are really in the mindset of opening up Broadgate and having as much shopping as possible. The challenge, if you like, there was when you're standing in Liverpool Street Station, you're looking towards our building. In fact, you can see the previous one out of the window there. And the view through the Mall is completely blocked with sort of old kiosks and all manner of detritus. This is what it was originally like. And even though it was double height, it still had these bridges coming across and a sort of bit of an 80s look to all of that. But it was at least clear on the way through. You'll also see it sloping up and down and got different changes of level, which were problematic. And by the time we came to work on the project, it had been filled up by Network Rail's sort of desire to make ever more money. So here you see all these elements in the middle, ramps, handrails. I mean, it was a bit of a mess. So when we pitched for the job, we sort of talked about, well, here you see the change of level. Here you'll see our building, which will start to look something like it is on the right. And your next project, 1 to 2 Broadgate, will suffer because it'll be this sort of 1.2 meters up. So when you build that, you'll have the fulcrum in its existing position. And we would like to persuade you, Mr. Client, that actually what you should do is lower the fulcrum. So that's about 1.2 meters it had to come down. British Land weren't minded to spend millions of pounds doing that at the start of the project. But as the project went on, they grew in confidence and could see the value of that, not only for how you got into the shops, but just for the simple continuity across the estate. So this is an example of how Peter Fogo's architecture had all these idiosyncratic levels, which were now becoming quite problematic. So they bit the bullet and they paid to have the Richard Serra lowered. This looks like a model, but it's actually from a CCTV. Over the course of a couple of days, this was lowered on hydraulic jacks. Each one of those metal pieces are separate, individual as well, so it's quite a complicated operation. So these were just sort of images of this thing gradually dropping about a meter to the new level when it was refounded on concrete. So as you can see there, you'd come straight through. In the temporary condition, the change of level was still there. This has all been knocked down now, and they're building 1 to 2 Broadgate. So we'd done that. That was good. We had 2 floors of retail. When we started the project, they only wanted 1, but they wanted 2. So, effectively, it's a shopping centre underneath the building. But given the arrangement of the building, we still needed our reception to be in the middle of the building, which will be above the shopping mall. And that really is not what you do in commercial office terms at all. You have your reception at ground floor level. So we had to work hard to kind of make this workable and convincing to put the reception effectively up at second floor level, above a lower ground, upper ground and first floor level. So what you're looking at here is the atrium up above the reception. This is the reception level here. These are escalators we put down to go across and through to Liverpool Street Station. So this is the upper ground and this is the lower ground, and way through to the circle. And you'll see the looming volume of number 5 Broadgate in the background. So this was our kind of reimagined building with a lower ground and then 2 floors of retail, so 3 floors of retail altogether. The sculpture repositioned and actually just visible looking out towards what will be the new building beyond. If you cut a section through in the other direction, what we had was the atrium was sort of elliptical. So along this axis, it looked like a cylinder or continuous in its width. And we had 2 escalators that took you up from the ground floor street level up to the reception level. And here you see all the offices and setting back at the top and plant on the top. So in 3-dimensional terms, the Liverpool Street station's on your right. We have the Sarah sculpture at grade here. We've got ways into the Crossrail station by Wilkinson Air over here. And then as we go up a level, you're now at pavement level. You might recognize these sort of curvilinear steps on the main front entrance. And this is your main way in. And here you'll come in and you'll go up escalators up the 2 floors to the reception. There's a way into the restaurant at roof level here, so you can come in and go up. And then we've got all sorts of retail wrapping around onto the public realm on this sort of mezzanine level. The bus station I mentioned under the building is up here on the right hand, top right. And the bollards obviously are there for security, given the proximity of the station. So that's how that sort of planned out. And then we had a separate way in off the circle as well. It was a similar configuration with a double set of escalators going up 2 floors. So when you arrive up at the reception level, you're in this space here. You're looking out at the sculpture here, the reception desk here. We've got a separate cafe space, and then there's a thing called Story, which is where British Land have a WeWork facility, and that's in this part of the building. And this part of the building, there's actually a gym and other activities behind the reception here. And then you start to stack up the offices, and you'll see how the cores are with all the toilets and the cores and everything working very hard to bring down air from above. So this is looking in the mall, and the reception is this space up here. So just going back 1 floor, you're standing down here looking up at this part of the reception. Oops, right. So yeah, so you're looking at reception, then the retail down here, and this sort of network of walkways around between the retail. So if I just take you on a quick journey up the building through the plans, which might be quite useful to orientate yourself. So this is the gyratory at low level in the basement, and here we have bike storage and bike for the bikes, and the bikeway in off the gyratory road, which is up here, and then this is all beneath the retail units owned by Network Rail. We seem to be struggling to move on a slide. So this is the bike storage area, and you'll see these orange bits of structure and brown underneath. The orange represents where the floor slab used to be when we started work, but to fit the right number of bikes in, we actually excavated down, took the slab out, excavated down. That is the old pile cap that the piles was founded on that had the structure on top, and that was to gain enough height to get all the equipment and 2 floors, 2 sets of bikes on this level. When you're doing a project like this, the floor space is so valuable on the upper levels that you don't want to be knocking out ground floor or whatever to put bike storage in. So digging down here was a viable commercial activity to get the bikes in at this level, but was part of the ingenuity that the team had to come up with. As you then go up a level, you're at the sort of lower ground level, coming through from the station. There's the escalators up. You then go through to the circle. Here's the Richard Serra. This is the Boots, the biggest Boots in the country, I think, which is owned by Network Rail and other shops at this point. The regret we have on the project was we never got permission to break through with the Crossrail and come through into the mall at this point, but you're not allowed to do that. Once Crossrail started, there's no changing it. So these are the retail units, restaurants around the circle you might recognise. As you then go up a level, you've got the entrances in off street level. So those are the receptions I was describing. The pink is all retail. There's a series of restaurants here that are 2-storey that pick up afternoon sun on that side. So that's quite nice. There's the bus station. And there is the bus station tucked underneath the building, which is quite problematic, as you might imagine, to kind of fit in. You'll notice there's a series of louvers here. And actually what we managed to do was between the trusses of the bus station fit the bike changing area. So we slotted those in literally between the trusses you can see there. Again, a sort of space-saving mission, not to take prime space for something that didn't need it. And here you start to see the upper levels of all the retail wrapping around. So we got some nice bike changing. We worked on these with UDS, Universal Design Studio. They've not got the tallest ceiling height because they're wedged in between the trusses, but they're absolutely fine. And some, meeting all the codes on bike parking and bike changing now is a really important part of any office building and something they all tend to compete on. So by the time you get to reception level, this is all the office. This is the reception itself. And then as you go up, we have this atrium, which, as I said, started off as square, and we managed to sort of shape in this interesting ellipse. And as you go up the building, that tends to reduce. Later on in the project as well, we got kind of their sanction to add a stairway in here to encourage people to walk up the building, reduce use of lifts. And as it happened with COVID, that was a sort of positive thing to have in the project. And going up the building, you'll see the atrium gradually shrinking as we go up. And so all the cores in the building have very well done toilets, all sort of beautifully fitted out of the same standard. So the tenants come into this sort of commercial building, they fit it out completely, but the core, the toilets and the common areas like the lifts are all done by the client. And so we did all of those. As you go up the building, then this atrium starts to shrink. And taking this floor, this shows how you can divide it up. So one person could rent the whole floor, could be rented by 2 people, could be rented by 3 people, or could be rented by 4 different businesses, all in that same layout. And that's kind of obviously important for commercial flexibility. So as you're going up the building, we then start to step in. And that's one of the reasons why the atrium starts to shrink, because as you go up, the outside footprint of the building starts to get smaller. And so that allowed us to bring greenery onto the outside of the building, which is obviously a real positive for the tenants to be able to go outside and enjoy the greenery. And so we worked very hard on that because these were slithers of space and they would sort of taper down to nothing. So we had to make those feel like they were meant and give them decent space to work in and get a good amount of planting on there. So again, as we're going up, these are starting to step in and step back. And again, continuing the theme of this curvilinear building with a rectilinear piece on the back. And so these become really quite special spaces. We put the balustrades up, which did have curved glass on the smaller circuits because they were starting to wrap around the corners. Nice olive trees there. And the building's still just being finished at this point. Here you can see the roof light over the atrium, which was a very challenging thing to build because there was no structure under that circle at the bottom of the building. So it's actually the mullions that carry the weight of the structure on the top of that. There's a terrace up here, which will have a restaurant on it, which is still being fitted out. And then you start to see the office floors stepping down. So as you go up, this then was one of the floors we added on top of the building. And this was, in fact, that was the penultimate, the last one. And this was the first floor of plant in darker grey down here. And then as you go up to the next floor, my slides aren't changing. As you go up to the next floor, there's 2 floors of plant. And I think on a building like this, the plant's quite challenging. In the city, they have a rule. You have to have some louvers over the top of the plant. You can't just leave it exposed. There's so many tall buildings looking down on you. So what we did here, we were very keen not to just put a kind of grillage of louvers up there and have those sat on top of this nice crystalline, mellifluous sort of curvature. So we wanted to use glass on the plant rooms, albeit just single glazed, but we needed to bring air in. So what we did is we pushed the glass back, you'll see on this section, to allow air in at the bottom. And then we just had some louvers on the top to provide the visual screening. But that allowed the air in to keep the plant cool as needed. But what we realized is we went around a tight radii, that started to look really terrible. So we did a thing where we pushed it in on the straight bits and then brought it back to vertical as we went around the corners. So some quite sophisticated stuff going on between sort of concept design and final detail design to make sure all of this all worked together. And the final effect is you don't particularly notice that's plant up there. You can read it slightly different, but it adds a layer of interest and maintains the integrity of the architecture right up to the skyline. So just taking you on a kind of bit of a journey as you come in. This is off 100 Liverpool Street. We're coming into a double height reception. It is a retained structure, so you get columns where you might not normally put them. So you probably wouldn't normally put a column straight in eye line with the bottom of the elevators, but that's kind of part of what you have to live with, and a valid thing to be doing. So the client wants to have coffee shops and activity down at this level, but this is just a precursor really to getting up to the top of the building. This is coming in off the circle where we've got some nice art on that level. The project had been an old station before, so the inspiration for that was sort of more references to railways. And you can just see on the left-hand side the way into the Mall, and at the top you can just see where you're aiming for with the reception. So as you're going up that escalator journey, you can start to see the reception, and that starts to appear, and you can start to see the staircase. So quite active, quite dynamic spatial arrangement. And there you see the staircase, the open stair that takes you up. And you start to see the curvature and the way all of that works. This is a view from the staircase looking down, and so you can see out. And one of the things, going back to the reference about a tower building, in a tower you generally go up the core, you arrive on your floor plate and you look out and you've got spectacular views, but you're looking at the city. Something about a building like this, which is intriguing, is that you're looking back to the public realm, and because the building wraps around, you're actually looking back across to your own building, which is interesting. And here you are at the reception desk. You can see the top of the Richard Serra sculpture there, and you see the pair of escalators arriving in this space. And you can also see above a sort of light fitting we designed with Spears and Majors, which was about not having really bright light shining down at you, but bouncing light off these elements, this halo as it was called. And we worked very hard on this internal glazing. And just going back to the tenant arrangements, we designed sort of 1 meter into their space so we could have this circuit of lights around the atrium, after which they could do what they wanted in that space. And when you look up, here's a nighttime shot, seeing how that elliptical space goes to a circular space, and that all the weight of all of that is taken on the mullions, as I say, coming down. That was attractive to Victoria Beckham. I don't know if you saw it, but did a photo shoot in there, which involved standing models on circular glass platforms and spinning them around underneath that space. So it is actually very photogenic. This space is open to the public. There's a cafe in there. By all means, just walk in. It feels like you're going into a private office building, but you're very welcome in there. You can just walk into either of those entrances, go up to reception, have a look, and have a drink in the cafe. So just sort of finally, going back to the identity of the building and the work the Universal Design Studio did alongside us, they sort of looked back at the old Broad Street station, which was a sort of commercial station that had been on the site pre-Stuart Lipton in 1984-85 when it was developed, and started to think about how we might use the geometry of the train tracks to help us navigate around these columns and around the building. And came up with this very nice idea. We could use this sort of train track motif to take you to the gates and all those kind of things on this floor level. So we have our own little series of train tracks that sort of give you some direction between escalators and where you may be going to staircases and lifts, etc. And that all worked very nicely. This is the view down off the staircase over the reception desk. And unusually for a building of this nature, you're actually looking across into other tenant spaces. So if you're in a tower, you go up, you get out on your floor plate, and you don't see your neighbours. Here you're looking across and you can see into all your neighbours' offices. So I think it's very communal. It's got a very strong sense of community in that regard. And I think that's a positive and less anonymous for your city workers. And that is me at the end of the slide. So maybe you'd like to open up and have a discussion at this point.
Thank you very much, Mike. Just let's see if I'm back. Hang on a minute. Am I back? Yes, I'm back. Thank you. Thanks so much. What an amazing journey through a building from something quite, well, intensely complex and a really, really complicated bit of city to bringing us down into kind of a very rational journey through the process of not only the process of making the building, but also understanding its spaces. So thank you so much. A masterclass, I would say, for all students and how to present a project. Granted, you had quite a lot longer. Students tend to have about 10 minutes, but I suppose that's something I might pick up on if others don't have huge numbers of questions, which I suspect they will. So I'm inclined to go straight to the chat. I guess the big sort of pieces for me in listening to your description were so much around the exploration around a visual perception of such a huge object, both internally and externally, and combining that with then obviously the process of material selection, combinations, and then navigation of spaces as well, and navigating in a kind of coherent way. So it may be something that we pick up on a bit. But I will, as I said, I will go to the chat room. We have a couple of questions, so I'm gonna kick off with those, if that's all right. I think we've got a very straightforward question from Ashita. Runta, what was the strategy for the waste material from the demolition? Was any of it able to be used elsewhere?
It went off to sort of second-hand recycling markets, but we don't have a specific sort of story on that about where it ended up. But I think you'll find nowadays that you can take that material and it does go off and get very well processed and recycled in a sort of circular economy fashion. I mean, as I mentioned, they had a funding agreement with their funding partner. They had to retain 50% of the structure. I think, there were times in the project when they were kind of cursing that because it cost a lot more to do this than to knock it down and put up new structure, which is a sort of side point to the question, but of relevance. Because when British Land made the decision about the next building, 1 to 2 Broadgate, they actually demolished the structure because they needed to change the grid. They did, I believe, sell on that steel frame from the previous building, but this was obviously a combination of steel and concrete. So concrete's a harder thing to, put back and recycle if it's not precast, which it wasn't here. So all the basement and everything was maintained. So we're talking about the upper levels really. And I don't know where the pink granites ended up. I mean, it's of an enormous value in itself. I guess relatively low carbon because it's stone, but it's probably been brought in from Portugal or somewhere. But it will be interesting for someone to go off and do a whole study on that. You almost need to have tracking devices on these elements. But as a designer, you don't really follow on from that, even though we'll be intrigued to know. So not a very good answer to your question, but I believe it's all gone off and been recycled and resold. It has a value as well these days because people are looking to buy reusable material from previous buildings.
Mm-hmm. No, well, that's it. Well, it's really interesting, and yes, what a fantastic project for somebody out there to do. It's exactly the kind of thing that certainly in academic projects is constantly asked as a question. Where are you going to take this? What are you going to? So it becomes the responsibility of the architects to do that.
I mean, one thing I didn't show you was that when we did this project and took out half that structure, an enormous amount of steel had to be brought in to prop up the bits we were retaining and make it stable while it was worked on. So there was a lot of secondary structure that we had to clamber over on site. That was all just bolted in place to brace it, a lot of it being diagonal. That all sort of gets cut and used and then goes off, and that also needs to be recirculated. I'm sure it is because it's just sort of propping, but on a job like this, those elements are proper structurally sized. It's not just acro props and scaffolding. So there is there's a sort of hidden part of construction, which is about waste and temporary steelwork and all the rest of it. You don't see in the final building. And unless you're doing a really thorough carbon orbit, doesn't, always appear in people's kilograms per square meter story either.
Yeah, great point. Charlie from AKT AKT2 is with us, and he says he believes that the pink granite, also present on 1 Broadgate, was crushed and recycled for aggregate.
Okay.
So maybe AKT2 can help us with some of that follow-on story. Okay, I'm going to take our very own Zafir Amin has asked, has said, I actually did my part 1 working on the Crossrail station below. Did you have to incorporate any special design features to deal with vibrations, noise, general impact of the new Crossrail station?
Not really, no, because it was a sort of neighbouring structure and we had already had to take into account the tube stations underneath. And, to some extent, the foundations were already there and had already survived any issues around vibration with the existing tube stations. So, no, just going back to that point, that we were asked at the end of the job, what did we regret? And the regret was we couldn't make a link from their ticketing hall for Crossrail through into our basement, because that would have been fantastic with the flow of people. But once those Crossrail stations are on site, you can't then go back and start going back a design phase. They just have rules like that, I think, to try and manage the overspend and program slippage. So great shame. Future generations can tunnel through.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say the potential overspend of lowering ground level, which is just an incredible story, I suspect was enough for one project. But thank you. That was very good. Katie Fisher asks, other than the structure, how do you consider embodied carbon within the project?
Well, the calculation for the embodied carbon is everything. So it's the glass and everything else as well. You have to take, embodied carbon equivalent has to include absolutely everything. So we did on the WWF project, which was quite a long time ago now. They employed Simon Sturgis to do an audit, and it literally involved every time the lights were turned on in a site hut or a lorry came to the site, that was absolutely fully measured. And so it's useful to know all of that detail. It's a really challenging industry because, unlike economics, a lot of it doesn't get recorded. It's invisible, and some of it's counterintuitive as well. You don't always get it right. It doesn't entirely follow kind of cost. So it is a challenge for us all to sort of know where carbon is going and to make decisions on that basis. Really, you can make better judgments if you had carbon data at the same time you're looking at a product and you're looking at its financial cost. So on WWF, we did that more because the client had a slower program. It was less aggressive on time. And we looked at absolutely everything about the embodied carbon on the project as we chose it. And it was interesting because between having a building which is laid out at stage D and finally building it, we probably reduced the carbon by about 50% of what it could have been to build effectively the same building by making every choice informed by carbon as well as economics. And there was an interesting example there, which was a paradox, was that it was, given Simon's input, we realized that it was actually less carbon intense to specify double glazing, or better environmentally to specify double glazing and not triple glazing, because the extra framing and carbon inherent in all of that was not going to pay itself back over the course of the life of the building. So there's a few things like that are thrown out when you've got the facts and figures in front of you. And I think as an industry, we need to sort of campaign to have that. And, you'd like to think with BIM and all of these sophisticated technologies we have now, as you're looking at elements and feeding in products, the data will be there. So you can assess carbon and make a choice, not just on aesthetics and cost, which is pretty much what we do now, but have all that carbon data there to hand because you need it in the moment you make the decisions.
Yeah, it's
still got some way to go to get that.
And you're factoring that in over the notional lifespan of that building, I'm assuming, or is it over? How do you define that period of time?
You don't really define the time. You just, it's the amount of carbon per square meter. I think if you start bringing time in, it will be very complicated because, you're designing for 60 years and your double glazed units need changing after 25 and all of that. So it's just, at the minute, it's on a per square meter basis, which is why I say if you're building a very small building, you're going to be up against it because your ratio, your form factor ratio is going to be worse. So this is a really big building, so it's got a very good form factor, i.e. the ratio of facade to floor area. Yeah. So the bigger it is, well, the more like a sphere it is, the more efficient it's going to be in cladding it, and also in performance terms, in terms of heat loss as well. So big buildings do have benefits.
There you go. That's a good advert then. There's another carbon question. How much carbon was actually saved, or do you know how much carbon was actually saved by retaining the frame? I think you...
I don't have that number to hand, but if you think we're at 389 and most office buildings are around 650 or struggling, to be at that number, you're probably talking 250 to 300 kilograms per square meter equivalent. So most of that was from the facade retention, and a bit due to the fact that it's in a big scale. And therefore, the amount of facade, the amount of glass on the building isn't that much per square meter because it's so big. Yeah. That makes sense.
Hope that is what you were after, BHA out there. I think there's another. I'll go back to a question that's come in earlier, but I will come back to it because it's on a slightly different tack. But did you consider using a different material on the structure, like CLT or mass timber?
Not really, no. I mean, the steel on there is working incredibly hard. I just don't think you could have done it out of CLT. I mean, we've done CLT buildings, but they're smaller spans and smaller scale buildings. And interestingly, British Land. I mean, I think what really happens out there is that the boards of these big corporations and companies make declarations under pressure from the likes of yourselves to be more environmental. And so British Land is targeting, 500 kilograms carbon on their buildings and all of this. And I think they kind of incentivize their senior leadership to get to those, those targets and really force them to do it. So they're all running around working out how to do that. And actually, when you're designing these buildings, if you speak to the agents, they love an office building to be on a 9-meter grid because it's less columns, more freedom in the space. It's on a 1.5 module, etc. But a bigger span is typically much more carbon. So you might find in the future buildings have to have more frequent columns to reduce the spans down. They certainly need innovative structural solutions to keep the carbon down to start with before you get into cladding and all the rest of it. So you just can't get to very low carbon unless you start thinking about it from the structure and everything at the outset. So it is starting to make an impact. And I think this idea that the boardrooms have made these promises about carbon levels, they don't really understand the implications, but they've made the promises and it's forcing their organizations to go out and look at how they can achieve it.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
Yeah. There's a very, I think, probably quick perfunctory question or possibly answer. Why the 1.5 meter grid, which I think you just touched on, but maybe
I'll let Sophie answer that.
In that a bit more.
Yes, 1.5 meters is a sort of magic number that office agents love because when they come to try to let this office space to different tenants, it's a sort of sort of rule of thumb of what is an acceptable grid. So when you're laying out desks in the space, you can have a kind of an efficient layout when you're also cellularizing the space. So when you're putting partitions against an external wall, you can have a 3-meter wide office, for example. That's really where it comes from. But a lot of people in the office design world will start talking about 1.5 modules. But as Mike said, and we've had this on another project, I think the grids, the established and accepted grids of office buildings in particular are going to be challenged by needing to build in CLT. And we've had this on another project where we had to go and ask the agent, can we go from 9-meter grid to a 7.5 meter grid, for example, and not lose a huge amount of value? And actually, in this case, they did, because they saw this building that we're working on with a CLT frame as being something that they could market as making the building more attractive to future tenants. So it's sort of about helping the agents to, build the story around the building. You've probably seen, or students have probably seen, how buildings are marketed like this. I mean, they are kind of branded and sold in a way, that's, tries to sort of tell a story about the building. They've got a particular look and a style. And this, again, the sort of embodied carbon is now helpfully becoming part of the story of these buildings.
Interestingly, though, and you look across the whole marketplace, I think the most conservative aspect of the industry that's holding us back is the agents, because they are like estate agents. They're trading space. They're not actually investing in it. They're not designing it. They're not building it, but they're trading it. So they get a percentage for letting the floor plate. So they will get a bit like an estate agent. They'll get a certain amount of money from the deal, and they go to all the people that want floor space wherever they are in the world, and they go to the clients who've got the buildings, and they sort the deals out between them. but they're incredibly conservative. They're the most conservative part of it in terms of change. And actually, if the industry is going to change, they need to be under pressure to change. So if clients are saying we need to move into a more ecological, sustainable building, and that we're prepared to accept changes to the conventions to do that, and we want to know what the carbon story is, that's got to be a good thing, because that will force them to change.
Well, that's a brilliant bit of inspiration. We often are looking for clients and engineers and others who work in the making of our buildings to participate in reviews and design reviews, but we're going to start inviting some agents in. That would be extremely good. I mean, I think that relationship between grid and perception of what an office environment is like, and then progress, i.e. the progression of how we occupy offices and where we work and how we work, is such a fascinating matrix, really, I would say. And then obviously grid then in relation to material is an incredible dynamic. And it seems to me that's a real opportunity for students to experiment with, just to get one, to familiarize oneself with that dynamic, but also to kind of see where are the potentials, where can you kind of make an inroad into thinking about where we, work or spaces for workspaces in a kind of new way. I wonder how much of the conversation when you're designing a building, again, the project is so vast and it is a piece of city. It's not just a building, it is a piece of city, really. How much of the conversation is around those social behaviors and human behaviors around the workplace?
I think, there's, two challenges on this building compared to the sort of thing you were talking about at the start, Samantha, about Hopkins buildings. Is this is not for an owner-occupier. These are all let spaces. So we don't develop a relationship like you might do with the Christie family and building Glyndebourne, where they know what they want, or they're on a journey with you to get something very special. This is generic space. And unlike those other Hopkins buildings, which are sort of small and crafted, and you can think about it as an entity in its own, very complete thing, this is enormous. And so a lot of it was about breaking it down. And I guess the client doesn't particularly have conversations about the community and the sociability. They have more sort of definite targets they're looking for, which is about area and that kind of thing, fundamentally about profit. And so they might be more private conversations we have offline, if you like.
I mean, it might be worth mentioning, Mike, about this building when the building, the sort of the concept of the building, particularly the interior, was developed. The client was very keen to explore an appeal to a much broader range of tenants than you might typically expect in the city, and that's why we helped them to choose Universal Design Studios, the interior designers, because they wanted to have that sort of appeal wider to the sort of particularly the kind of more creative community around Shoreditch and London's East End. And they saw this building as being a slight sort of crossover into both the world of the city, but also sitting more comfortably in London's kind of design district.
Yeah.
And that was reflected really in the design of the building, both inside and outside.
Great. No, I mean, it's your opening statement about or this opening statement about sort of fortress Broadgate becoming 24/7 Broadgate is an incredible reflection of how we view that particular piece of London and London generally. Certainly in my own career of architecture, I think it was that piece of steelwork you showed right at the beginning of the presentation was the year I started studying architecture. So it left an indelible impression on what architecture could be or might be, or the way London was evolving, for sure. So it's amazing to see how that's changed, and the city has changed, and our whole agenda around why we're building, what kinds of buildings we're making are changing. I think we are very, very close to drawing to a close. There is a couple of sort of very nice comments here, just saying thank you, Mike and Sophie, for an excellent presentation and wonderful project to be a part of. That's from Charlie at AKT2, who truly believes this has set a blueprint for architects and engineers for retention and reuse of steel composite buildings. So there is another fantastic endorsement for this kind of approach, and also another thank you very much for an amazing conversation, very insightful. So we are about 3 minutes out now. Unless any other questions come up.
I've got a comment, Samantha.
Mike would like to
worth noting, we were sort of anxious about the size of that building and could we make it likable? And hopefully we have. I do think it's definitely worth all nipping in there and having a look if you haven't done so. But when you see here's the Moran's proposal for the building on top of Liverpool Street Station, it gives you some idea of the kind of economic realities we live in and the sort of power of clients of a certain type to just go for these incredible developments that have, they're not emanated from thinking about what the city needs. They've emanated from thinking about, as ever, form follows finance. How do we make some money? And so any anxieties we had about that being too big are just within a year or two of it being finished, massively eclipsed by the proposal to build on top of Liverpool Street Station, which I think would be a disaster. But who am I to say?
Well, yes, you may have done your piece. No, it is still it's a fiercely heroic bit of heroic. Maybe isn't the wrong word now. We used it a lot, didn't we, in the 80s? Piece of the city. Those are big buildings vying for attention against with each other, and trying to work very, very hard. So it continues to live on, regardless of other conversations, which are actually about shrinking a lot of architecture and making it almost disappear entirely. So amazing, fascinating presentation, Mike and Sophie. Thank you so much. I hope you will join us, maybe come to the LSA for a review or two. We'd be delighted. Come and see if we actually, any of our students tackle something quite so enormous, and guide them through it. That would be fantastic. And it just leaves me to say thank you very much to everybody for joining.